Thanks, Kim, and hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. So first, I'm going to share my screen. So in 1924, the American Turner Society waived membership fees for newly arrived German immigrants, and their rationale was the following, quote, "Immigrants will not only strengthen your society, but you can help them to become American citizens. Do not let Americanization be carried on by the forces of intolerance and exploitation to turn the newcomers into voting cattle." That same year, the Johnson-Reed Act was signed, an immigration act that established what historian May Nye called the legal foundation for social processes that would unfold for the next several decades, processes that historians have called for European immigrants becoming American. In my Keystone project and in this presentation that I'm about to give, I'm going to argue that while German Americans were subject to these same social processes that May Nye discussed, World War I had a massive and lasting impact on their unique cultural expression through the 1910s and the 1920s. And before I specifically discuss that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the effects of World War I when it happened. So the war, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, it had a lot of different impacts throughout the world, but for America specifically, who entered the war in 1917, it created a lot of tension, specifically around the lives and livelihood of German Americans. Prior to the entry, many German associations and newspapers, schools and churches still primarily use the German language for their activities. Prior to America's direct entry in the first 3 years of the war, actually a lot of those associations were entirely pro-neutrality, or in some cases even in favor of the Central Powers, including the German Empire. And so once America entered, these customs were targeted both by the American government and propaganda publications like the one that you can see on the screen right here, and also in different laws that they passed that restricted speaking out against the war, and the public even formed what were called national defense committees. There were these private groups that would go around to neighbors to check whether they were supportive of the war enough and were buying war bonds. And other studies have measured how these events affected German cultural expression, and have measured how German language usage in public was greatly reduced, and how many of those German language newspapers and associations either completely ceased activity or switched over to the English language. And so kind of building off of those projects, I wanted to look at how German American identity shifted, specifically because of World War I, through the following years, and specifically how that identity shift occurred in their political life. And in order to do that, I looked at the American Turner Society, which the president had that quote that I said earlier, which was a German socio-political organization that kind of interestingly enough discussed physical exercise and liberal politics. Those are two things that they merged together into an interesting combination. And then I also looked at the voting records of 10 counties in central Texas that at the time had majority German populations. And I wanted to look at how these two different case studies really highlighted the effects on political life for German Americans. And ultimately, I looked at those results in the framework of assimilation theories. So to begin, I'll discuss a little bit about the American Turners. Like I said, they were this unique combination. Their organization supported this unique combination of exercise and politics. You can see a photo of them here from 1909. And they were founded originally in the mid-1800s with the arrival of German immigrants. And over the decades, as we progressed through into the 20th century, they really reduced their direct political activity and became more of a cultural outlet for German Americans. And so I recorded the membership levels of the National Association, which were recorded in annual reports. And as you can see, prior to the war, which started in 1914, the organization had sustained growth. And even during the war, it actually had a little bit of a rebound in those early years from an initial drop. And my analysis started when this gap in reporting occurred. So when America was directly fighting in the war, the National Executive Committee of the organization did not publish any sort of reports or anything like that. And when they started doing it again in 1919, their membership had dropped significantly, even lower than what they had in 1902. They'd switched the organization's name from a German word to the American Gymnastic Union. They switched over all documents to English, and they didn't discuss any sort of political activity. That membership drop continued through the early 1920s until 1923, 1924, when the National Executive Committee switched to a different city with new members, shifted their name again to a German word, and started discussing current political issues and even addressing the First World War again. And that brought some membership levels back up, but it was short-lived, and ultimately the organization saw an even increased drop with the Great Depression. So what's evident here is really the profound impact that America's direct part in the war had. Prior to America's entry, the organization saw no significant difference in the membership levels, but once America entered, it permanently changed the face of the organization, and it struggled to find relevance beyond there. The next part of my project looked at a specific state that had, like I said, relatively geographically isolated German immigrants who came again in primarily the mid-1800s and settled between three major cities in Texas in relatively rural counties. And at the time of these voting records, from 1960 to 1928, these would have had over 50% population that would have identified as German American. And when I recorded from another previous project, the voting records between the state of Texas and just those 10 counties, it's pretty evident how distinct the voting patterns for German Texans were at this time. So in every single election, you can see significantly different voting amounts between Republicans and Democrats. And in the 2 years, 1920 and 1924, when there were third-party candidates for president, there's significantly higher third-party voting. And to put this in context, 1916 was immediately before America's entry. And the Wilson administration, who was running for re-election at the time, was kind of pushing this "he kept us out of the war" narrative in his candidacy platform. But a lot of German American newspapers and organizations were suspicious of what they kind of considered this one-sided neutrality that was really in favor of the British. And so what that led to is a 40-point difference in Democratic voting right there, which you can see from 81% to 44%. In 1920, a significantly different landscape yet again. This is the first presidential election after the war ended. It's the first presidential election after Prohibition started, and it's the first presidential election when women could vote. A lot happened in this 4-year time span, and the results yet again are significantly different. Democratic voting is much, much lower, and was likely some sort of, or at least for these German Texans, a referendum on the actions of the Wilson administration. He wasn't running in 1920, but those impacts carried over. And so you can see, that the results of 1916, 1920 really highlight the immediate impact of World War I on their voting patterns. And the next 2 years, next two elections, 1924 and 1928, yet again, even beyond the war, there's significantly different voting. These two elections likely had more to do with Prohibition and the different stances. In both elections, the Democratic candidates were in favor of repealing Prohibition. And specifically in 1928, there's an interesting shift where the state of Texas votes Republican for the first time, and German Texan counties vote primarily in favor of the Democratic candidate, who is, as I said, anti-prohibition and also, incidentally, a Catholic, which really mattered at the time. And so these results all taken together really highlight the unique political affiliations of German Texans at the time. And the two elections immediately surrounding World War I, they show that the war, the fear of the war, and the aftermath of the war did ultimately really impact the way that these individuals would have voted. And the difference in their voting patterns from what you might call the median white Texan voter of the 1920s, it's still out of lockstep for those next elections. And that pattern carries on even after the war ended, a full decade after the war ended in 1928. And so ultimately what I found in my project is that World War I really heightened assimilative pressures on German Americans, which you can see both in the way that the American Turner Society struggled to stabilize their membership rates following the war, struggled to find messaging that really connected with German Americans at the time, and in the way that German Texan voting patterns shifted wildly across those 12 years, usually out of lockstep with the Texan voting patterns as a whole state, but also with themselves switching party affiliations and things like that. And so while other political issues dominated far beyond the war, things like prohibition and other issues, it's evident that the war had a great impact on cultural German distinctiveness in public life, which has been shown in other projects, and on political and associational ties. However, those ties did still continue in some forms beyond the war, even as they were reduced. And so ultimately, this created kind of a unique assimilative process for German Americans that I think can really be highlighted by what I've shown here. And that was essentially kind of all the findings that I found. I really appreciated everyone that helped me on this project, my advisor, Dr. Bruce Schulman, the Kilachand Honors College, and all the other groups and individuals that really helped me bring this together, friends and family. So yeah, thank you very much.